Happy Pride! Ignore my hair, it's a little humid. We're just doing what we're doing. I wanted to talk about this book I was reading by Bell Hooks and the concept of women feeling guilty about misandry or other people, men or women, putting on them this idea that they should feel guilty or wrong about like participating in misandry, expressing it, being open about it, or just generally having a very solid dislike of men, right? And I was reading A Will to Change by Bell Hooks. And if you don't know, Bell Hooks is a really popular feminist from like the 90s. And I want to preface this by saying this isn't a critique on Bell Hooks as a feminist or like the work that she's done, because this is the only book by hers I've read because my library doesn't have the other ones. I have a theory that my library, because it's in like a small rural red area, is like running a conservative psyop, because they have a lot of books that cater to like conservatism and men, and they don't have a lot of books that don't. It's kind of weird. Anyways, so Bell Hooks is a very popular feminist. Most of her books are about women for women, but A Will to Change is the only book that she wrote like about men for men, and it was sort of meant to be like a guide for them to deconstruct their patriarchy. And what I do love about the book and her initial like thought process and opinions on the subject is that men do kind of need some type of blueprint to follow. And an easy way to give them that is feminist theory, right? And that is one of her first critiques of feminism in the book regarding that time period. So like the 90s, early 2000s, was that feminism was on the rise. Feminist theory was on the rise and being, read and published on a much larger scale. But there wasn't a lot of feminist theory around how men and women could deconstruct the patriarchy in their brain, specifically men. And I do agree that feminist theory should lay some kind of groundwork or blueprint, especially so that everyday women in life are not responsible, right? So that men have something to refer to. And at this time, I can totally understand where Bell Hooks was coming from with this concept that they hadn't necessarily laid that groundwork or that theory at that point for men to follow. And so she writes this book, A Will to Change, talking about how men need to have the will to change, to deconstruct their patriarchy and their misogyny and learn how to have healthy, loving relationships with women, right? I didn't finish the book, which was my first book this year that I did not finish, so kind of sad about that. But I just could not find it in me to finish it because there were so many little comments on misandry and specifically feminists who hate men, and how basically in that time period, at that moment, Bell Hooks felt that that was regressive to the movement. Rather than consistently talking about how much you hate men, she leaned a lot more towards admitting that you just wish they were better, and then in some way like helping them through that. However, she does specifically talk about how feminist theory would be beneficial to help them through that. So this isn't necessarily so much of a critique on Bell Hooks specifically or her work, because I haven't studied her work and at the same time in depth, and at the same time, if it's still being read and spoken about today, I think that speaks volumes, right? People are not responsible for being 100% correct 100% of the time, so it's totally fine if some of her ideologies are a little like outdated, considering they quite literally are from decades ago, right? So Bell Hooks aside, I don't appreciate the concept that women are somehow responsible for helping men deconstruct the patriarchy, right? At the same time, I can understand her argument that we all coexist together as humanity. And if we really would like to see a society where men have overcome the patriarchy, women need to participate in some way, right? And I agree with her that the best way to participate while not getting directly involved is to publish feminist theory that they can refer to, right? However, there was just a lot of commentary from her on negating the concept of misandry and referring to it in a lot of ways as if it's regressive. And I disagree with that. I disagree. And it was really irritating me, this implication that women have some type of responsibility for deconstructing the patriarchy in men, when men are not deconstructing the patriarchy in women, right? And we don't hold them accountable for deconstructing our patriarchal beliefs, right? We hold them accountable for deconstructing the patriarchy because it's male-centered, right? They're the ones who mainly uphold it and ensure that it continues to exist. through their behaviors, through the way they view women, through the way they view themselves and other men, et cetera, right? And so while I can understand that at the time that Bell Hooks wrote this book, there probably wasn't a lot of feminist theory to walk them through that, and I agree that it could definitely be beneficial for feminists to publish that kind of theory so that they can refer to it rather than the women in their lives and expecting the women in their lives to do free emotional domestic labor for them and help them deconstruct. And I think this concept around feeling guilty about misandry or other outside people trying to make you feel guilty about your level of misandry. I even had a conversation with an older woman in my family the other day. And when I made the very blanket statement that I was very serious about, that I generally dislike men, it was somewhat negated, right? Where this woman was like, come on, like, you don't like and hate them all. Like, it's not that serious. It is though, girl. It's more serious than you could possibly imagine. You don't want to be in my brain. I'm kind of a violent person. I was raised in a violent household, so you don't want to know what I really think about men. I was sparing you on that one. And I think it's funny, this concept that, you know, older generations are not so comfortable with the heavy misandry that younger women are getting very comfortable with. And there's a lot of pushback, not only from patriarchal men, but from patriarchal misogynistic women, right? That in some way we should feel guilty about the level of misandry we're participating in, that to Bell Hooks' point, it's not helpful, it's regressive. And that in some way women are responsible in playing a certain role so that men can dismantle the patriarchy. And I disagree with that. I think it keeps you trapped in this misogynistic mindset that women exist to serve, right? Even when they receive nothing in return. And that is an aspect of conservative femininity, that if you are a feminine woman, then you are nurturing, you are motherly, and you exist to tend to other people and receive nothing in return for that, because it's just who you are as a woman. No. And I think it keeps you trapped in this cycle and this mindset that stems directly from the patriarchy, that, you know, while men are not leading the way of dismantling the patriarchy that they uphold and violate women under and oppress women under, they're not leading the way in dismantling that, which goes to show you how they feel about women and how they feel about themselves, right? They're egotistical and they hate women. They like the patriarchy because it benefits them, and they don't care that it directly oppresses and violates women because that benefits them too, right? So when you think about this concept of the fact that women are dismantling the patriarchy in themselves on their own, through what? Feminist theory, largely. And who published feminist theory? Other women. So women are supporting each other in dismantling the patriarchy, and women individually are supporting themselves, right? They're going to therapy, they're reading feminist theory, they're keeping friends with certain types of women who are not misogynistic and competitive and male-centered, right? And they're dismantling patriarchal ideologies in themselves, they're working on themselves in all these different ways, and they're educating themselves on how to do that, right? Largely through other women, right? Feminist theory, female community, feminists online, and themselves, right? And then there's this expectation from misogynistic women and patriarchal men that feminist women are too harsh on men with their level of misandry. They should feel bad about that because it's actually furthering the problem. Mind you, blaming women for their issues, right? Because when these men respond to misandry with violent misogyny, red pill content, violent attacks on women, et cetera, they turn around and they blame you and they say, well, you should have been a misandrist. You made me upset. Right, but the fact that you got so upset about that and couldn't control yourself was your fault. That's you. So it just repeats this cycle of blaming women for things that are males' problems, right? These are men's issues, and they need to resolve them on their own, and they are capable of that. But it paints this narrative that men are too incompetent to do this on their own, and they need women to do it for them, which traps women in this misogynistic cycle of serving men and receiving nothing in return. So A Will to Change was the first book this year that I did not finish. And I actually tried to record this video before when I actually still had the book from my library, but I had to return it. So maybe I'll include a snippet of me reading some of the statements I'm specifically referring to so you have a good example of what I'm saying. All right, so I just want to read a couple snippets of like examples of the things she's saying to emphasize how this is rhetoric that is rooted in misogyny and this patriarchal idea that women exist to serve men and need to hold their hand through everything like they're their mother. She says, nowadays I'm amazed that women who advocate feminist politics have had so little to say about men and masculinity. Within the early writings of radical feminism, anger, rage, and even hatred of men was voiced. Yet there was no meaningful attempt to offer ways to resolve these feelings. to imagine a culture of reconciliation where women and men meet and find common ground. Militant feminism gave women permission to unleash their rage and hatred at men, but it did not allow us to talk about what it meant to love men in patriarchal culture, to know how we could express that love without fear of exploitation and oppression. You can't do that until the men dismantle the patriarchy. You can't do that. You can't love them without fear until they dismantle the patriarchy, and it's not your job to do that for them. And then in another page, she says, women and men alike in our culture spend very little time encouraging males to learn to love. Girl, what? Even the women who are pissed off at men, women most of whom are not and maybe never will be feminist, use their anger to avoid being truly committed to helping create a world where males of all ages can know love. Y'all know that TikTok audio that's like, I'm irritated as fuck, I'm irritated as fuck, I'm irritated. But I do feel like the ideology is a little bit outdated, and I do feel like it's a patriarchal ideology. And it's funny because I posted a video talking a little bit about this on my TikTok, and I'll actually include a screenshot, because this person commented and was like, this concept that women should feel guilty about misandry or that they should be aiding men in their deconstruction. I said that it was a patriarchal ideology, right? That was rooted in misogyny and putting women in this role of indentured servitude towards men and other people, right? And someone commented on the video and said, this isn't a patriarchal ideology, it's a feminist ideology from bell hooks, right? And they then tried to imply that I don't know what I'm talking about, because if I knew anything about feminism or whatever, then I would know that. Well, I do know that. I'm actually talking about it because I'm reading bell hooks right now. Thank you. So it was so funny because I responded to them with a picture of A Will to Change by bell hooks, and I was like, yeah, I know. The thing is, though, that you're claiming that because bell hooks put this in a book and then published it as feminist theory, that makes it a feminist ideology. No. Women are indoctrinated and propagandized under the patriarchy to be patriarchal and misogynistic. We suffer as well, right? It affects us and our brain and our mindset and the way we think about things as well. So I believe, and bell hooks is her own human and can say whatever she wants, right? But my perception of it is that she felt it was feminist when really it was a patriarchal ideology that she hadn't dismantled yet. This concept that it's somehow wrong for women to be hateful towards men and just express that discontent with them and not offer them anything else, right? How it's regressive for feminists who hate men, who at one point she implies are not actually feminists. Weird. Are actually just like harmful to the cause, because there should be some level of aiding men in their deconstruction, and it's not beneficial to just simply hate them and provide them with nothing. I think it is helpful. It's called social outcasting. It's survival of the fittest. I've talked about this before in my video specifically about misandry, that it is a form of social progression to socially outcast men who refuse to progress and dismantle the patriarchy. And you can do that through misandry. Right? Women who are participating in 4B, abstaining or becoming celibate from men, refusing to have any type of relationship with them, genuinely living their lives as if men do not exist to the best of their ability. Yes, that is helpful, and it's not regressive. It forces social progression. It's survival of the fittest. It's like basic evolution. And so it's interesting to me that this person, I make this video on TikTok, and this person kind of is like, this is a feminist ideology from bell hooks, this idea that women should aid men in their deconstruction. They're claiming it's a feminist ideology because I referred to it in my video as a patriarchal ideology. And that's funny to me, because women are not exempt from being indoctrinated by patriarchal ideologies and thinking that they are progressive. And again, this is where I go back to the fact that it's totally fine if bell hooks, has a bit of an outdated ideology, because this book is decades old. It is quite literally outdated. And we have quite literally socially progressed past this, right? And I think what's interesting about bell hooks' book too is that these men have now had the blueprint. We do now have plenty of feminist theory that they could study. Mental health is also so prominent now, right? It's readily available. The feminist theory and the therapy is readily available for these men to deconstruct. They do not need individual women in their lives to hold their hand and aid them through that. And they do not need to be supported by random women through it to feel good about themselves. That's not a necessity in any way whatsoever. And women are not receiving that from men in their deconstruction, right? That being said, that in and of itself isn't inherently a feminist ideology just because a feminist spoke on it. Feminists are not responsible for being 100% correct 100% of the time, because we are human beings who are also living under and indoctrinated by the patriarchy. So I do believe that bell hooks published this ideology as a feminist theory, and I believe that she hadn't dismantled that level of indoctrination yet to understand, and at the same time, it was a different time, right? But she hadn't dismantled that yet to see clearly that it was a patriarchal ideology. That's what I believe. So I do believe it's a patriarchal ideology. I don't care that it's a popular feminist theory from a popular feminist. Women can be patriarchal. We're all living under the patriarchy and are subject to it. At the same time, Bell Hooks says in her book, hey, right now, there's not a lot of theory that walk men through how to deconstruct the patriarchy. And I think feminists should publish theory around that so that we don't have to hold their individual hand. And that is feminism, right? Because that's dismantling the patriarchy. I agree with that 100%. And I totally understand if at the point she was talking about that in the 90s or early 2000s, that hadn't existed yet. And that she did believe if that theory was published, that men would be more likely to deconstruct. But she was wrong. The theory has existed for decades, and men are no more likely to deconstruct than they were at that time. So I completely understand her mindset, decades ago, thinking, well, maybe they're not deconstructing because we haven't, walked them through how to do that with feminist theory. And that is an act of feminism, to publish theory on how men can deconstruct the patriarchy, of course. Because deconstructing the patriarchy is what feminism is, right? Creating an equality of sexes through deconstructing the patriarchy. So I totally agree with that. But me reading it from my perspective 30 years later after it was published is like, misandry is not regressive. It's not harmful. It's patriarchal, misogynistic to blame women for being misandrous and claiming that they're actually harmful and regressive to the feminist movement. That's patriarchal, misogynistic. It's just an outdated ideology. Outside of that, I understand that Bell Hooks felt at the time that if these men did have this theory, then they'd be more likely to deconstruct, but that was not true. Men are not more likely to deconstruct because they have the theory and they have therapy and mental health treatment readily available. They're even less likely. And it just goes to show that they double down on purpose because they're not interested in deconstructing. And it's easy for them to use little scapegoats like blaming women and blaming misandry or blaming a lack of access to someone who can support them through their deconstruction. Mind you, they don't need to be supported through it. You just do it yourself. I understand that at that time she felt like that was true and that was a progressive ideology, but I disagree at this point, 30 years later, that has proven to be true. The theory exists, the therapy exists, and they don't want it. They don't want to participate in it, and a lot of them double down on violent patriarchal misogyny in response to being asked to deconstruct. And I just wanted to speak on it because I think it is that ideology that misandry is regressive, is super outdated. I think it's patriarchal. I think it's misogynistic. And, not a critique on Bell Hooks because I haven't studied her work. No one's responsible for being 100% correct all the time. That's totally fine. And it's totally fine if the theory is outdated because the book is outdated. It's decades old. I think it speaks volumes that people are still studying her work to this day, right? So not really a critique on her specifically or her work or her as a feminist. I just wanted to, acknowledge that some women might naturally feel a bit guilty about the level of misandry they participate in, or you could be like me and you have older women in your ear telling you that it's not appropriate or that maybe you should feel guilty or it's wrong in some way or it's regressive in some way. You have conservative men reiterating this, right? And then you might read outdated feminist theory like A Will to Change, where then she's kind of talking about it and applying it. And I just want to say, it's not regressive. You have nothing to feel guilty about. These men can deconstruct on their own just like you are. They don't need women to hold their hand, and that's a misogynistic narrative that they're trying to keep you trapped in. It's the same thing as like when women stay with men who are not the best to them, but when they sit down, these women sit down with these men and talk to them about it, and they keep telling these women, I'm gonna improve, just don't leave me. I'm gonna improve, just don't leave me. They never improve. And you also don't leave them. They're just trying to keep you trapped. They have no intention to change. And I would encourage women to understand also that no one's going to change unless they want to. So if you have to come to that man and sit him down and tell him he has a problem and he needs to change it, he probably ain't going to, because people don't want to change unless they want to. And he probably likes the misogynistic patriarchal dynamic that y'all have. And what a lot of women find is that when they do help men through their deconstruction, or they do sit and try to help them improve on themselves, whatever, they slowly become less and less attracted to these men. Why? Because they feel like their mother. It traps you in this misogynistic cycle of serving and mothering and nurturing patriarchal misogynistic men, enduring their patriarchal misogynistic behaviors and receiving nothing in return, because by the time it's all said and done, you're not even attracted to that man anymore anyway. You don't even want to be with him. It's okay to be a misandrist. It's okay to aggressively hate men, and it's okay to express that and not offer them any aid. We don't owe them anything. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not regressive. I'd argue it's actually progressive.